Okay, today we're going to read chapter 2 of Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's very nice outside at my house today, so my windows are open, and you might hear birds. If someone starts mowing a lawn or blowing leaves or doing something noisy, I'll get up and shut the window, okay? I don't know if you can hear the birds, but I can hear them, and I love it. So at the end of chapter 1, Edmund, Lucy, and Eustace had gotten on to the Dawn Treader. And Caspian had given Lucy his cabin, the captain's cabin, the king's cabin. And she is going to wear some of his clothes because her clothes are soaking wet from being in the ocean, in the sea. And it ended with her saying, or in her mind, she said she felt quite sure that they were in for a lovely time. I'm sure they are too. And I think I would rather be on that ship today than home. Though I'm happy to be home and reading. So that's the second best thing. Chapter 2, On Board the Dawn Treader. Ah, there you are, Lucy, said Caspian. We were just waiting for you. This is my captain, the Lord Drinian. A dark-haired man went down on one knee and kissed her hand. The only others present were Reepicheep and Edmund. Where is Eustace? Asked Lucy. In bed, said Edmund, and I don't think we can do anything for him. It only makes him worse if you try to be nice to him. Meanwhile, said Caspian, we want to talk. By Jove, we do, said Edmund. And first about time. It's a year ago by our time since we left you last before your coronation. How long has it been in Narnia? Exactly 3 years, said Caspian. Do you remember that Edmund is the one who really wanted to figure out how time worked in the book before this, in Prince Caspian? And now he's doing the same thing. Exactly 3 years, said Caspian. All going well? Asked Edmund. You don't suppose I'd have left my kingdom and put to sea unless all was well, answered the king. It couldn't be better. There's no trouble at all now between Telmarines, dwarfs, talking beasts, fawns, and the rest. And we gave those troublesome giants on the frontier such a good beating last summer that they pay us tribute now. And I had an excellent person to leave as regent while I'm away, Trumpkin the dwarf. You remember him? Dear Trumpkin, said Lucy, of course I do. You couldn't have made a better choice. Loyal as a badger, ma'am, and valiant as a mouse, said Drinian. He had been going to say as a lion, but he noticed Reepicheep's eyes fixed on him. And where are we heading for? Asked Edmund. Well, said Caspian, that's rather a long story. Perhaps you remember that when I was a child, my usurping Uncle Miraz got rid of 7 friends of my father's, who might have taken my part. And he sent them off to explore the unknown eastern seas beyond the lone islands. Yes, said Lucy, and none of them ever came back. Right, said Caspian. Well, on my coronation day, with Aslan's approval, I swore an oath that if once I established peace in Narnia, I would sail east myself for a year and a day to find my father's friends, or to learn of their deaths and avenge them if I could. These were their names: the Lord Revilian, the Lord Byrne, the Lord Argos, the Lord Mavramorn, the Lord Octesian, the Lord Restamar, and, that other one who's so hard to remember. The Lord Roop, sire, said Drinian. Roop, of course, said Caspian. That is my main intention. But Reepicheep here has an even higher hope. Everyone's eyes turned to the mouse. As high as my spirit, it said, though perhaps as small as my stature. Why should we not come to the very eastern end of the world? And what might we find there? I expect to find Aslan's own country. It is always from the east, across the sea, that the great lion comes to us. I say, that is an idea, said Edmund in an odd voice. But do you think, said Lucy, that Aslan's country would be the sort of country, the sort that you could sail to? I do not know, madam, said Reepicheep, but there is this. When I was in my cradle, a woodwoman, a dryad, spoke this verse over me. Where sky and water meet, where the waves grow sweet, doubt not, Reepicheep, to find all you seek. There is the utter east. I do not know what it means, but the spell of it has been on me all my life. After a short silence, Lucy asked, "And where are we now, Caspian?" "The captain can tell you better than I," said Caspian. So Drinian got out his chart and spread it on the table. "That's our position," he said, laying his finger on it, like this on the map somewhere. "Or it was at noon today. We had a fair wind from Cair Paravel and stood a little north for Galma, which we made on the next day. We were in port for a week, for the Duke of Galma made a great tournament for his majesty, and there he unhorsed many knights. And got a few nasty falls myself, Drinian. Some of the bruises are there still," put in Caspian. "And unhorsed many knights," repeated Drinian with a grin. "We thought the Duke would have been pleased if the King's Majesty would have married his daughter, but nothing came of that." "She squints and has freckles," said Caspian. "Oh, poor girl," said Lucy. "All right, just a second. If someone squints and has freckles, that is no reason to not marry them. We'll assume that they also weren't compatible. And so Caspian, instead of saying something mean like we weren't compatible, just talked about her freckles and her squinting. "Well, we sailed from Galma," continued Drinian, "and we ran into a calm for the best of 2 days and had to row. And then we had wind again and did not make Terebinthia till the 4th day from Galma. And there the king sent out a warning not to land, for there was sickness in Terebinthia. But we doubled the cape and put in at a little creek far from the city and watered. Then we had to lie off for 3 days before we got a southeast wind, and we stood out for the 7 Isles. The 3rd day out, a pirate, Terebinthian by her rig, overhauled us. But when she saw us well armed, she stood off after some shooting of arrows on either part. And we ought to have given her chase and boarded her and hanged every mother's son of them," said Reepicheep. He always wants to fight. "And in 5 days more, we were in sight of Mule, which, as you know, is the westernmost of the 7 Isles. And then we rowed through the straits and came about sundown into Red Haven on the Isle of Bren, where we were very lovingly feasted and had victual and water at will. We left Red Haven 6 days ago and have made marvelously good speed, so that I hope to see the Lone Islands the day after tomorrow. The sum is, we are now nearly 30 days at sea and have sailed about 400 leagues from Narnia." "And after the Lone Islands?" said Lucy. "No one knows, your majesty," answered Drinian, "unless the Lone Islanders themselves can tell us." "They couldn't in our day," said Edmund. "Then," said Reepicheep, "it is after the Lone Islands that the adventure really begins." Caspian now suggested that they might like to be shown over the ship before supper. But Lucy's conscience smote her, and she said, "I think I really must go and see Eustace. Seasickness is horrid, you know. If I had my old cordial with me, I could cure him." "But you have," said Caspian. "I'd quite forgotten about it. As you left it behind, I thought it might be regarded as one of the royal treasures, so I brought it, if you think it ought to be wasted on a thing like seasickness." "It'll only take a drop," said Lucy. Caspian opened one of the lockers beneath the bench and brought out the beautiful little diamond flask which Lucy remembered so well. "Take back your own, Queen," he said. And they then left the cabin and went out into the sunshine. This is a little jar I have that I keep ink in, but it reminds me of a diamond jar because it has all those cool little cuts in it so that it kind of glimmers different directions. I will pretend that this is Lucy's diamond jar with ink in it instead of cordial. In the deck, there were 2 large, long hatches, fore and aft of the mast, and both open, as they always were in fair weather, so they could let light and air into the belly of the ship. Caspian led them down a ladder into the after hatch. Here they found themselves in a place where benches for rowing ran from side to side, and the light came in through the oar holes and danced on the roof. Of course, Caspian's ship was not that horrible thing, a galley that was rowed by slaves. Oars were used only when the wind failed or for getting in and out of harbor, and everyone, except Reepicheep, whose legs were too short, had often taken a turn. At each side of the ship, the space under the benches was left clear for the rowers' feet, but all down the center, there was a kind of pit which went down to the very keel. The keel is the bottom part of the boat that's under the water. And this was filled with all kinds of things: sacks of flour, casks of water and beer, barrels of pork, jars of honey, skin bottles of wine, apples, nuts, cheese, biscuits, turnips, sides of bacon. From the roof, which meant the underside of the deck, people walked up here, but from the deck, from underneath it, hung hams and strings of onions, and also the men of the watch off duty in their hammocks, sleeping. Caspian led them aft, stepping from bench to bench. At least it was stepping for him. It was something between a step and a jump for Lucy, and it was a real long jump for Reepicheep. In this way, they came to a partition with a door in it. Caspian opened the door and led them into a cabin which filled the stern underneath the deck cabins in the poop. Remember that that's a boat term. It was, of course, not quite so nice. It was very low, and the sides sloped together as they went down, so that there was hardly any floor. And though it had windows of thick glass, they were not made to open because they were underwater. In fact, at this very moment, as the ship pitched, they were alternately golden with sunlight when the ship came up, and then dim green with the sea when the ship went down. "You and I must lodge here, Edmund," said Caspian. "We'll leave your kinsman the bunk, and we'll sling hammocks for ourselves." "I beseech your majesty," said Drinian. No, shipmate," said Caspian. "We've argued all that out already. You and Rince was the mate, are sailing the ship, and you will have cares and labors many a night when we are singing catches or telling stories. So you and he must have the port cabin above. King Edmund and I can lie very snug here below. But how is the stranger?" I'll show you the first picture from this chapter now. This is where they are in the cabin, where Drinian is the guy with the green, sort of the cape on. He's the guy who's the captain of the ship. Prince Caspian is, what do you think is on his tunic that he's wearing? Remember, you're listening to figure out what planet influences Voyage of the Dawn Treader. There's Lucy, there's Edmund, and Eustace is laying in that bunk. His face is kind of green because he's seasick. And he was throwing up before, remember? Blech. Eustace, very green in the face, scowled and asked whether there was any sign of the storm getting less. But Caspian said, "What storm?" And Drinian burst out laughing. "Storm, young master," he roared. "This is as fair weather as a man could ask for." "Who's that?" said Eustace irritably. "Send him away. His voice goes right through my head." "I've brought you something that will make you feel better, Eustace," said Lucy. "Oh, go away and leave me alone," growled Eustace. But he took a drop from her flask, and though he said it was beastly stuff, even though the smell in the cabin when she opened it was delicious, it is certain that his face came the right color just a few moments after he had swallowed it. And he must have felt better because instead of wailing about the storm in his head, he began demanding to be put ashore and said that at the first port he would lodge a disposition against them all with the British consul. But when Reepicheep asked him what a disposition was and how you lodged it, Reepicheep thought it was some new way of arranging a single combat. And he always liked to fight, remember? Eustace could only reply, "Fancy not knowing that." If this were in America, Eustace might have said, "I want you to put me on shore in California right away, and then I'm going to call the sheriff, and I'm going to have somebody get in trouble." They're using British terms, which If you don't live in Britain or England, you might not know. Eustace could only say, "Fancy not knowing that." In the end, they finally succeeded in convincing Eustace that they were already sailing as fast as they could towards the nearest land that they knew, and that they had no more power of sending him back to Cambridge, which was where Uncle Harold lived, than of sending him to the moon. After that, he sulkily agreed to put on fresh clothes, which had been put out for him, and to come on deck. Caspian now showed them over the ship, though indeed they had seen most of it already. They went up on the Foxhole. That might look like forecastle in your book, but they say Foxhole. And they saw the lookout man standing on a little shelf inside the gilded dragon's neck and peering through its open mouth. I'm going to show you what that looks like, because I know I saw a picture of that somewhere here. Here. That's what it looked like where he stood. So that's the front of the ship, right, which is the dragon head. And there's the lookout man inside the mouth looking out. Do you see he has a little telescope? And do you see who's standing on the dragon, on the neck, sort of? Remember that, because that's going to come up in the story pretty soon. So there's the lookout man in the mouth and Reepicheep on the neck. Let's see. Where was I? Okay. They went up on the forecastle and they saw the lookout man standing on a little shelf inside the gilded dragon's neck and peering through its open mouth. Inside the forecastle was the galley, or the ship's kitchen, and quarters for such people as the boatswain, the carpenter, the cook, and the master archer. If you think it's odd to have the galley in the bows of the ship, and you imagine that the smoke from its chimney streaming back over the ship, that's because you're thinking of steamships where there's always a headwind. On a sailing ship, the wind is coming from behind, and then anything smelly is put as far forward as possible. They were taken up to the fighting top, and at first it was rather alarming to rock to and fro there, and to see the deck looking small and far away beneath you. You realized that if you fell, there was no particular reason why you should fall on board rather than in the sea. Because if the mast is here, and the boat bottom is here, and it's tipping like this, and you're here and you fall, you'll go down into the water. It might hurt more at first if you hit the deck, but at least you'd be on the boat still. Then they were taken to the poop, where Rince was on duty with another man at the great tiller. And behind that, the dragon's tail rose up, covered with gilding, which means gold covering, and round inside it ran a little bench. The name of the ship was Dawn Treader. She was only a little bit of a thing compared to one of our ships, or even with the cogs, dramens, carracks, and galleons which Narnia had owned when Lucy and Edmund had reigned there under Peter as the High King. For nearly all navigation and sailing had died out in the reigns of Caspian's ancestors. When his uncle, Miraz, the usurper, had sent the seven lords to sea, they had had to buy a Galmian ship and man it with hired Galmian sailors. But now Caspian had begun to teach the Narnians to once more be seafaring folk, and the Dawn Treader was the finest ship that he had built yet. She was so small that forward of the mast there was hardly any deck room between the central hatch and the ship's boat on one side, and the hen coop, Lucy fed the hens, on the other. But she was a beauty of her kind, a lady, as sailors say, her lines perfect, her colors pure, and every spar and rope and pin lovingly made. It might be fun for you to draw a picture of the Dawn Treader, and maybe even to draw a map of what all the inside parts were. Eustace, of course, would be pleased with nothing, and he kept on boasting about ocean liners and motorboats and airplanes and submarines, as if he knew anything about them, muttered Edmund. But the other two, Edmund and Lucy, were delighted with the Dawn Treader, and when they turned aft to the cabin and supper, and saw the whole western sky lit up with an immense crimson sunset, and felt the quiver of the ship, and tasted the salt on their lips and thought of unknown lands on the eastern rim of the world, Lucy felt that she was almost too happy to speak. What Eustace thought had best be told in his own words. For when they all got their clothes back, dried, next morning, he at once got out a little black notebook and a pencil, and he started to keep a diary. He always had this notebook with him, and he kept a record of his marks in it from school. For though he didn't care much about any subject for its own sake, he cared a great deal about marks, grades, and would even go to people say, "I got so much. What did you get?" But as he didn't seem likely to get many marks on the Dawn Treader, he now started a diary. This was his first entry. Now, when you listen to Eustace's diary, remember what you know about Eustace so far, what kind of person he is. August 7th. Have now been 24 hours on this ghastly boat, if it isn't a dream. All the time, a frightful storm has been raging. It's a good thing I'm not seasick. Huge waves keep coming in over the front, and I have seen the boat nearly go under any number of times. All the others pretend to take no notice of this, either from swank or because Harold says one of the most cowardly things ordinary people do is to shut their eyes to facts. It's madness to come out into the sea in a rotten little thing like this. It's not much bigger than a lifeboat. And, of course, absolutely primitive indoors. No proper saloon, no radio, no bathrooms, no deck chairs. I was dragged all over it yesterday evening, and it would make anyone sick to hear Caspian showing off his funny little toy boat, just as if it was the Queen Mary. I tried to tell him what real ships are like, but he's too dense. E and L, that's short for Edmund and Lucy, of course, didn't back me up. I suppose a kid like L doesn't realize the danger, and E is buttering up to C, Caspian, as everyone does here. They call him a king. I said I was a Republican, but he had to ask me what that meant. He doesn't seem to know anything at all. Needless to say, I've been put in the worst cabin of the boat, a perfect dungeon, and Lucy has been given a whole room on deck to herself, almost a nice room compared with the rest of this place. C says that's because she's a girl. I tried to make him see what Alberta says, that all that sort of thing is really lowering girls, but he was too dense. Still, he might see that I shall be ill if I'm kept in that hole any longer. E says we mustn't grumble, because C is sharing it with us himself in order to make room for L, as if that didn't make it more crowded and far worse. Nearly forgot to say that there's also a kind of mouse thing that gives everyone the most frightful cheek. The others can put up with it if they like, but I shall twist his tail pretty soon if he tries it on me. The food is frightful, too. The trouble between Eustace and Reepicheep arrived even sooner than might have been expected. Before dinner next day, when the others were sitting around the table waiting, by the way, being at sea gives one a magnificent appetite, Eustace came rushing in, wringing his hand and shouting out, "That little brute has half killed me! I insist on it being kept under control. I could bring an action against you, Caspian. I could order you to have it destroyed." At the same moment, Reepicheep appeared. His sword was drawn, and his whiskers looked fierce, but he was as polite as ever. You've probably figured out that Reepicheep is always a chivalrous gentleman. "I ask your pardon all," he said, "and especially Her Majesty's. If I had known that he would take refuge here, I would have waited a more reasonable time for his correction." "What on earth is up?" asked Edmund. What had really happened was this. Reepicheep, who never felt that the ship was getting on fast enough, loved to sit on the bulwarks far forward, just beside the dragon's head, gazing out at the eastern horizon and singing softly in his little chirruping voice the song that the Dryad had made for him. Remember the picture you saw? And then the song that he told you? He never held on to anything, no matter how much the ship pitched, and he kept his balance with perfect ease. Perhaps his long tail hanging down to the deck inside the bulwarks made this easier. Everyone on board was very familiar with his habit, And the sailors liked it because when someone was on lookout duty, it gave one somebody to talk to. Why exactly Eustace had slipped and reeled and stumbled all the way forward to the forecastle, he hadn't yet even gotten his sea legs. That means being able to walk on the ship while it moves without falling. I never did hear why he did that. Perhaps he hoped he would see land. Or perhaps he wanted to hang about the galley and scrounge something to eat. Anyway, as soon as he saw that long tail hanging down, and perhaps it was rather tempting, he thought it would be delightful to catch hold of it, swing Reepicheep round by it once or twice, upside down, and then run away and laugh. So mean. At first, the plan seemed to work beautifully. The mouse wasn't much heavier than a very large cat. Eustace had him off the rail in a trice, and very silly he looked, at least Eustace thought so, with his little limbs all splayed out and his mouth open. But unfortunately, Reepicheep, who had fought for his life many times, never lost his head even for a moment, nor his skill. It's not very easy to draw one's sword when one is swinging round in the air by one's tail, but he did. And the next thing Eustace knew was 2 agonizing jabs in his hand, which made him let go of the tail. And the next thing after that was that the mouse had picked itself up again as if it were a ball bouncing off the deck, and there it was facing him, and a horrid, long, bright, sharp thing like a skewer was waving to and fro within an inch of his stomach. This doesn't count as below the belt for mice in Narnia because they can hardly be expected to reach higher than that. "Stop it!" spluttered Eustace. "Go away! Put that thing away! It's not safe! Stop it! I say I'll tell Caspian. I'll have you muzzled and tied up." "Why do you not draw your own sword, you poltroon?" cheeped the mouse. "Draw and fight, or I'll beat you black and blue with the flat," meaning the flat side of the sword, so that it wouldn't hurt. "I haven't got one," said Eustace. "I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in fighting." "Do I understand," said Reepicheep, withdrawing his sword for a moment and speaking very sternly, "that you do not intend to give me satisfaction?" "I don't know what you mean," said Eustace, nursing his hand. "If you don't know how to take a joke, I shan't bother my head about you." "Then take that," said Reepicheep, "and that to teach you manners, and the respect due to a knight, and to a mouse, and to a mouse's tail." And at each word he gave Eustace a blow with the side of his rapier, which was thin, fine, dwarf-tempered steel, and as supple and effective as a birch rod. Eustace, of course, was at a school where they didn't have corporal punishment, so the sensation was for him a complete novelty. That was why, in spite of having no sea legs, it took him less than a minute to get off that forecastle and cover the whole length of the deck and burst in at the cabin door, still hotly pursued by Reepicheep. Indeed, it seemed to Eustace that the rapier, as well as the pursuit, was hot. It might have been red hot by the feel. There wasn't much difficulty in settling the matter once Eustace realized that everyone took the idea of a duel quite seriously, and then he heard Caspian offering to lend him a sword, and Drinian and Edmund were discussing whether he ought to be handicapped in some way to make up for his being so much bigger than Reepicheep. Finally, he apologized sulkily, and he went off with Lucy to have his hand bathed and bandaged, and then he went to his bunk. He was very careful to lay on his side. And that is the end of chapter 2.